way back from Missouri, so Sam's been gracious enough to help and fill in, and that's quite the job. We don't think much about it, but it's a lot goes on back there. It makes our worship really nice to be able to enjoy these things. We've been in Genesis on Wednesday night, and I've really been enjoying getting into that study and loving looking at things, old things a little bit differently, and I really enjoy the idea of the Garden of Eden, and I wonder what it would have been like to been there, to been in God's garden, right? It had to have been beyond compare, didn't it? It had to be something that was unlike anything we've ever seen. The Bible tells us it was a place with no death, a place with no sickness, no disease. It was a place that gave you the ability to live forever. Isn't that kind of something that mankind has sought after, right? For forever, right? That fountain of youth, right? To be able to live forever. And God gave man that ability, put him there, made this perfect haven, this perfect garden for man to live in that was suited just for man. And God placed him within it, and man was able to tend it and to keep it and to enjoy it. And that would have been an amazing thing, wouldn't it, to be able to do that. God put everything they needed there, didn't he? Everything they needed to live, everything they needed to eat, everything they needed to be with God. And the amazing thing to me about the Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, is that God made room for himself in it. God didn't just create man and step back and say, I wonder how they do. Some people really think of that about God. We have people that are deists, and they really believe that there was a creator, but they just believe that when he got done, he just kind of stepped back and said, let it work out. Let's see how they do. But the Garden of Eden, that story tells us something that is vital. It says that God not only wanted to create us, God not only wanted to create a place for us to live, God wanted to be involved in his creation. And God, and when we see that in the story, because as we see, he come to walk with God, did he? But in the middle of this garden, and I always thought it was interesting, he put it right in the middle. But in the middle of this garden was this tree, right? And God told man, he says, you can do anything. You can enjoy this garden. You can live here. You can eat of this tree of life, and you can live forever. But he said, you just can't eat of this one tree, right? And he put it right in the middle. If you read that account, it was, Eve said it was pleasing to look at. She said it was good for food. I don't know how she knew that. She hadn't eaten it yet, but she said it was good for food, right? It was pleasing to the eye. Do you ever get the idea that this tree, of all those beautiful trees, all those beautiful plants in the garden, this tree was the prettiest, wasn't it? It was the prettiest tree in the garden. Best looking fruit. And Eve, boy, she saw that thing every day. She woke up, first thing she saw was that tree. And when you really look at that account, Satan, the serpent, didn't have to drag her over, right? Satan didn't have to say, hey, come over here to this tree. Eve was already there. She was looking at it. She was wanting it. She was desiring it. And the serpent just had to say, oh, guess what? You want to be like God? Take this, eat it. You'll be like God. The story is not the story of this lesson, but it's quite the story. But when you get to Genesis 3:8, even though this is really not about the Lord wanting to be with man, it tells you what God did. God came to walk with man, right? And in the cool of the day, the Bible says, God would come and walk with man. That would be something, wouldn't it? To walk with God in the garden. To just physically walk with God in the garden in the cool of the day. What would you talk about? I don't know. I don't know what Adam and God talked about, but they had some conversations, didn't they? And I don't know what those were. I'm sure it wouldn't be the same conversation I would have with God if I was able to walk and talk with him, but they had a conversation. And God wanted to be involved with them, and God wanted to be part of them and part of their lives and part of who they were. And don't you know, when Eve took that bite of that fruit and Adam took that bite of that fruit, and God knew that relationship was going to change. Don't you know that it broke his heart? You know, it's one of those things, it's like when you have children. You know, your children can do a lot of things that maybe you don't like or maybe bother you a little bit. But there's some things children can do that break your heart, you know? And I think that's what happened here. They broke God's heart. He said, don't take it, and they did. And then they tried to hide it, and of course God knows, and God found out. And don't you know, as hard as it was for Adam and Eve to be cast out of this paradise, out of this garden, don't you know it had to be just as hard for God to do it? You know, God made that garden for them, didn't he? He designed it, he built it, he planned it, he prepared it just for them, didn't he? Just for them. And then he said, you can't live here anymore. I'm going to cast you out. And you know, if you really look at Jewish oral teaching, oral writing, however you want to look at that, I know it sounds like an oxymoron to say that, but oral traditions of Jews that were handed down, they really wanted back in. Matter of fact, there's huge stories written about how Adam and Eve wanted back into the garden, and wanted back in so bad they tried all kinds of things. You know, God put that cherubim with that flaming sword there for a reason, because they wanted back. And I would want back in, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you want back in if you had that and you had that life and you were in that garden and everything was perfect and everything was great and it was wonderful, and then God kicked you out and God said, listen, I'm not just going to do that. I'm going to multiply your pain in childbirth. Women, blame Eve. It's not my fault, right? Going to multiply your pain in childbirth. Your desire be for your husband, who'll rule over you. He says, because you've listened to your wife, he says, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall grow for you. You will eat the plants of the field, and by the sweat of your face you will eat bread, to return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. You know, it's a huge curse God placed on them. They wanted back in that garden more than anything. And I think, truth be told, God wanted them in the garden. You know, God was able to walk with them and talk with them, and when they did that, that relationship was severed. It was irreparably damaged, and they could never get back to where they were before. They could never get back into that garden. Oh, they wanted to, and I would want to too. Why do I want in that garden? Why do they want in that garden? Because one thing, it was eternal. They could live there forever. They could eat that fruit and live forever. And the other reason they wanted back in that garden is because they had a personal relationship with God. Don't you know, as much as God probably missed talking to Adam, Adam probably missed talking to God. Don't you think? I mean, it would be something to wake up in the morning and know God was there. I mean, really there. I mean, we know he's there, but really there, right? Like, I can talk to you, God, like you're going to talk back. Right? You know, that would be an amazing idea, an amazing concept for us to wrap our head around. And they severed that. And God banished them, didn't he? He banished them from that garden. He sent them out to cultivate the ground from which he was taken, and he drove the man out. And to the east of the garden he stationed a cherubim with a flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. God said, you can't live forever anymore. On the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. And the serpent said, oh no, you're not going to die. And when Eve took that bite of that fruit, she said, oh, I didn't die. I mean, wouldn't you think that's the first thing you would think? Take a bite. Huh, still here, right? I mean, I don't know if she knew what death was. There wasn't any death, right? I mean, it probably was a new concept to cease to exist. But she's like, oh, still here. And when Adam come up, she goes, you know what? I ate this, and guess what? Still here. You know, still here. And Adam took it, and he says, still here. But they didn't realize what they'd done, did they? They'd severed that relationship. And you and I, unfortunately, we don't get do-overs. They didn't get a do-over. We don't get a do-over. God's not going to give us a chance to make that mistake again. We're never going to get that. God's never going to say, oh, well, I'll put you in there and see if you do better. Because God knows we're man. God knows we're not going to do better. God knows we're going to fail. God knew it when he put the tree there. We all know that. And man did just what God knew man would do. Man failed. And we've been failing ever since. Haven't we? I mean, we've been failing ever since. We failed God from the beginning of time. And we still fail him. And it's never changed. You know, it's kind of sad. God's given us chances and God's given us opportunities. God gave the Israelites chances. God protected them. God gave them opportunities. They failed. They failed. They failed. Finally, God says, I'm done with you. I'm going to send Jesus Christ. I'm going to send my son to give you a way back to me, to give you a way. And we hung him on a cross and we crucified him. And God's up there going, these people, seriously, these people, right? What do I have to do to get these people? But God has always desired, and then what you see throughout all this is God's always desired a relationship with his creation. And you just can't take that away from the Bible because the whole Bible is woven together with this thought. The whole Bible's woven together within the garden, within that story. It's the story of us. It's the story of man. It's the story of failure. But the garden also becomes a story of redemption. And we have to understand that, and we have to see that because you and I, to be truly who God wants us to be, we have to desire to be back with God. I mean, that's what the whole story is here. That's the whole story. I mean, you can make a theology out of it. You can do whatever you want to with it, but the whole story is we should want to be with God. You know, when he kicked them out of that garden, every day they saw that garden. You ever thought about that? I think about that sometimes. Every day they woke up, Adam's like, I got to go plow the ground, right? And they looked over there and they go, man, right there, you know, right there. If we could just go there, it'll all be good. Maybe that's the problem. We can't really see heaven. I mean, they try to give us pictures of it, but we can't really see it. You know, wouldn't it be something if every day when you woke up and it was the worst day of your life and things were really going bad and it was like everything was wrong, but you could see heaven right there. I mean, physically see heaven right there. You ever read the book Pilgrim's Progress? Everybody says they never read that book. I'm buying everybody a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Anyway, but in Pilgrim's Progress, you know, Pilgrim gets up to the top of this hill, in its Beulah land, right? And he gets up on top of Beulah land. And from Beulah land, he can look across and he can see heaven. When we sing that song, Beulah land, sweet Beulah land, is on thy highest mount I stand. I look away across the sea where mansions are prepared for me and view the shining glory shore, or have our home forevermore. Book comes out of Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim gets to the top of Beulah land. He's been through all these things, if you read the book. He's been through the valley of despair and all these different things he goes through. And he finally gets his friend, Christian, to go with him, right? And he gets up to the top of Beulah land, and he knows he's got to go through this valley. He knows he's got to cross the Jordan River. He knows he's got to do all these things. But when he's on top of Beulah land, he looks over, and he sees heaven, and he knows he can do it. You know, every morning, if we could wake up and see heaven, physically see it, we'd think, I'm going to go there someday. I want to go there. If I could just go there, everything would be all right, right? And that's what Adam and Eve had. They wanted back in that garden, back to the garden. And you and I in life and our trials of life and the things that we go through and the disappointments and the failures that we have, if we just thought, man, I could just get back to the garden, you know, just get back to the garden. And so they banished him and he threw him out and he put this cherubim there and he says, you can't go back. You can't go back. And in the New Testament, we start to use a different word. And it's a word, it's really interesting in the New Testament because when we talk about hell in the New Testament, that word's always Gehenna. And that's the valley of Gehenna that's always on fire outside of Jerusalem that burns. That's what the word hell is. You and I, when we see the word hell in the Bible, we see that word, you and I, you think flames, Satan, pitchfork, red guy, right? Demons flying around, you know, the abyss, That's what Rex sees. If you say hell in the Bible, that's what Rex sees. But when Jesus said hell to them, they saw this valley outside of Jerusalem, Gehenna, that was continually on fire, continually the pit stank. They burned animals out there. It was a place that even human sacrifices were made at some point. It was this terrible place. And that's the word Jesus used for hell. That's how he described it, because Jesus wanted them to see it. You see? Does that make any sense? It's hard to fear something you can't see, right? And so when Jesus wanted them to really be scared of where they were going, he says, Gehenna. Because here's this place outside of Jerusalem that reeks and stinks, and there's dead carcasses burning there, and the fire never goes out, and nobody wants to go there. So when Jesus said it, he didn't want it to be hypothetical. He didn't want it to be like, well, let me explain to you what hell is. It's this place with fire, and Satan's down there. He's got a pitchfork. He's a little red man. You don't want to go there, right? Because that wouldn't have meant anything to him, right? They went, well, I don't care, right? I can't see it. It's hard to be scared sometimes of things you can't see, right? They say what you can't see won't hurt you. Not necessarily true, but it's hard to be scared of things you can't see. So Jesus gave them something they could look at, and he said, this is it. And they thought, I don't want to go there. But what about heaven? How do you want them to go someplace? How do you want to go someplace that you've never seen? When you go someplace on vacation and you're going to take a trip, you Google it. Everybody Googles everything anymore. Google knows everything, right? And you take pictures, you look at pictures of it, or they get a postcard or brochure and they say, look at these white sand beaches and this wonderful, and boy, you really want to go there. It's going to be wonderful. And you're like, I really want to go there. I've seen pictures, right? I want to go there. So when you talk about heaven in the Bible, how does Jesus put it in a way that they're like, I really want to go there. I can see it, right? I can see it. And so in the New Testament, we get this word, paradise. And this word paradise in the New Testament, the word paradise literally means garden. That's what this word means, garden. And so when the thief on the cross, remember that? Y'all remember that story? Thief on the cross, remember? And Jesus is hanging with that thief, and the thief's dying on the cross. The thief professes Jesus is the Christ, right? And Jesus tells him something. He says, and I moved the comma. Yeah, I do. Because the comma's in the wrong place in this verse. Just throwing that out there. So I moved the comma on you, so don't be alarmed. So I moved the comma. And he said to them, truly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. You say, Rex, why did you move the comma? Because that's where the comma is supposed to be. Because let me read it to you the other way. Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Then let me move the comma. Truly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. Do y'all catch the difference? Why did he tell that guy, thief on the cross, that? Why did he use that word? Because he wanted that thief to see heaven. And how did he see it? Today you will be with me in the garden. Today you'll be with me in the garden. Now to you and I don't know what's in your mind, how you picture a garden, I have a non-green thumb. I literally can kill anything that lives just about. And so I don't know. Gardening was never my thing. But to them, to a Jew, when you said, today you will be with me in the garden, what did it mean to them? It meant Eden. What's so important about that? What's in Eden? Tree of life. God. You see, when he said that thief on the cross, and you and I, we mix this verse up our entire lives, but the amazing thing is when Jesus was standing there, just as sure as when he told people hell, he said Gehenna, because he wanted them to see the fiery pit outside of Jerusalem. When he said, today you'll be with me, why didn't he use the word heaven? Because what is heaven? Heaven was a kind of a foreign concept to a Jew. They had no idea what heaven. The book of Revelation hadn't been written yet, right? We don't know what heaven looks like without Revelation, right? So that would have meant nothing. Today you'll be with me in heaven. That didn't mean anything to a Jew. So what did he tell him? He said, today you'll be with me in the garden. And it just ties so much stuff together in Scripture to me about God and our relationship and what Jesus was telling him. Today you'll be where I am. I'm telling you today that you will be where I am. And that's an amazing thought. And when Paul, in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says, I was caught up into the garden. Doesn't that change how you read that verse when I say that? You know, we've heard that so long. Today, you know, I was caught up into paradise. And, you know, I guess we all got our view of what that is. But what Paul was really saying here is he said, I was caught up into the garden. You say, how is that, Rex? How does... You know, when the Jews were in the wilderness and wandering in there, Moses goes up on the mount, and God talks to Moses, and God says, Moses, I want you to build this tabernacle, this tent, this tabernacle, and this altar. I want you to build all this stuff. And I'm going to tell you exactly how I want you to build it. I want you to make it this big. I want you to build it out of this kind of material. These are the guys I want to do it. And he told Moses, he says, listen, Moses. He said, you do this exactly like I said. Exactly. You build this thing exactly like I told you to build it. And then if you really study this out through the Old Testament, you look at the book of Hebrews especially, you know what it says? It says it was the replica of what's in heaven, right? It's a representation of what's in heaven. And God wanted them, and so when the Hebrew writer says, oh, if you look at that, that was earthly, but that's a copy of what's going on in this in heaven, in this tabernacle up here, because we have to see things. We have to see things. And it's no different with here. We have to see that. And so we picture this garden. Here's this garden where there's no death, where these rivers are flowing. We picture this place that God's prepared, that God's made just for man. And in the middle of this garden is this tree of life, where man can take of this tree of life and they can live forever. And so it really ties together what Jesus was telling his apostles in John 14. Because in John 14, Jesus is almost to go, he's almost to be crucified. It's hours before the crucifixion. Y'all that know me know this is my favorite passage of the Bible. It's almost, he's almost to the point of being crucified. And when Jesus is talking to his apostles, he says, don't let your heart be troubled, right? Believe in God, believe also in me. And then he says what? He says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. But listen to the end of the passage. He says, I go to prepare a place for you. And that's something that really strikes me in what Jesus is saying, because I look at the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden was a place that was prepared for man. God prepared a place for man, and God placed man within it, and God walked with man, and God talked with man, and God interacted with man. It was a place of no death. It was a place of great beauty. And then Jesus tells his apostles, he says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Isn't it interesting? The thief on the cross, he says, I'm telling you today, you will be with me in the garden. You see? And then Jesus says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. You see, my whole life, I read the book of Revelation. I thought, well, I know what heaven looks like. Heaven's got streets of gold and gates of pearls. It's got big walls. It's built in a square, which seems kind of square. I know what heaven looks like. And then the more I study the Bible, the more I begin to understand that heaven's a garden. It's paradise. It's the garden of God. And it's this place where we don't die, and we can see it in our mind, can't we? Resting in the garden, being in the garden, walking in the garden with God. Waking up every morning and knowing God is really there, Christ is really there in our midst, in our presence. And the garden becomes this place that's prepared for us. And when you start to really put your mind in this concept, isn't it amazing that when Jesus went to the cross, he was in the garden? Isn't that just amazing? Jesus could have been in the temple. He could have been where they were in the upper room. He could have been in Bethany. He could have been at Mary and Martha's house. He could have been a million places. But when they came to get Jesus, where was he at? He was in the garden, wasn't he? He was in the garden. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's an amazing story in this, isn't there? Remember, in the Garden of Eden, there was no death, was there? There was no death. Nobody died. And so they come to get Jesus. The guard and the priests and the temple guard and the Roman guard, and they come to get Jesus. And when I picture that scene in my mind, I always picture the Frankenstein movies. Have you ever seen the old Frankenstein movies where they're coming after Frankenstein and they got all them pitchforks and them rods and they're marching up the hill and it's all black and white and grainy, right? But they're marching up the hill with their pitchforks and their torches and they're going to get Frankenstein. And every time I think about them going to get Jesus, this is what I picture in my mind. They're coming up there with their swords and their sticks and their lanterns and they're headed to the garden and they're this force and they're ready to go to war, ready to go to battle. And they get up there. And Jesus isn't ready to go to battle. Jesus says, "Oh, Judas, you betray me with a kiss." And then Peter, he takes his sword out, and he cuts off Malchus's ear. Boy, Peter's ready to fight, right? Peter's ready. Jesus, we're ready to go, right? We're going. This is on. We're going to have it out right here. Boy, Peter takes out his sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus. And Jesus... Why isn't there more to this story? All them people that came to get him, when he took Malchus's ear and he stuck it back on his head. It's hard for me to say that. He stuck it back on his head, right? It looks like at that point, you see why they fell down, right? But isn't it amazing? In the garden, they come to get Jesus and they're ready to fight. And Jesus takes that ear and he puts it back on Malchus because there's no death in the garden. It's no mistake Jesus was in that garden. No mistake that he was there and not in Bethany or not down in Jerusalem. He was there for a reason. It was teaching, because he said, "Today you'll be with me in the garden." It's unbelievable how it all ties together in the Scripture, how I missed it my whole life about going to the garden of God. We sing that song, Paradise Valley, right? Paradise Valley, idea of God's garden. And in the book of Revelation, doesn't it work out? In the book of Revelation, he showed me the river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God. If you read Genesis, so there was a river that came into the garden and it divided into the other rivers, the great rivers. And in heaven, this river, right, into the garden of God, clear as crystal, coming forth from the throne in the middle of the street, was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. You see, the garden was never destroyed. Was moved. God took that tree of life and put it where we could be with it for eternity, in the garden of God. So maybe sometimes when we think about heaven, maybe we need to quit thinking about gold streets and pearly gates. And maybe we need to start thinking about this beautiful garden of God, with the clear as water crystal and the trees of every kind and God in the midst, and walking with God in the cool of the day. And who's to say, just as Adam and Eve tended that garden in Eden, we're not going to tend that garden in heaven? Who's to say? Right? But I know one thing. I can see it in my mind. I can stand, as Pilgrim did, I can stand on Beulah land And if I really look, I can see my heavenly home where I want to be for eternity, where God dwells. Jesus said, I'm going to tell you, you'll be with me in paradise. You'll be with me in the garden. And that's what we look forward to. I hope that maybe you see it different next time you read it. I think we don't know as much as we think we know sometimes. And sometimes we need to kind of look a little deeper. If we can help you in any way this morning, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing?